What does a city infested with death look like? Shambling hordes of zombies wandering around eating an unsuspecting populace? Ghosts causing havoc and mayhem? Or otherworldly entities simply wreaking havoc and causing terror everywhere they go? But what if it was more subtle? What if the dead walked around you every day and you simply weren't wise enough to see it? That is where our story begins. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Today we are reviewing Bodymore by Ian Kirkpatrick. Many of you may already be familiar with Kirkpatrick's reviews and YouTube channel, and while I normally start with the first book that any author has done, this one struck me more than the first. So let's begin. Our story begins with our main character, Josephine, who insists on going by the name Joey. Joey is a mechanic for the Bodymore body shop. Joey has been called out to do a tow in the middle of the night by her friend Waylon Cross, which is most unfortunate because when she finds his car, Waylon is nowhere to be found. This is considered a very bad neighborhood. If you've ever been in a city that has crime problems, you usually know to avoid the parks at night. And Baltimore is no different. Jo is a little bit freaked out by the fact that she can't find her friend, but also doesn't want to stick around. In the process of hooking up his car, Jo shouts several times for Waylon to come and show himself, with absolutely no success. Eventually she decides that it's better to just leave, and if he needs anything he can call her. Upon making it back to the shop, Jo starts looking over the car and notices several problems, that it's chipped, that there are some spots that are worn, and knowing her friend, this is simply not something he would allow. Upon popping the trunk, she discovers a number of things. One, that it smells as disgusting as the park that she pulled it from, and two, there is a mutilated corpse in the trunk covered in mud. While discovering a body in Baltimore is not really surprising to anybody who has lived there long, there are a number of things that set this apart. First of all, Jo received what she believes to be some kind of chemical burn whilst hooking up the car. Second, the body is mutilated in a very unusual way. Much to her and her boss's chagrin, they have to call in the local authorities. Apparently, the cops in Baltimore are not the best of people, since they do not have a good reputation with either her or her boss. But where she's openly defiant with the cops, her boss is more of a lickspittle, trying to bribe them with fancy coffee and cookies. Jo is much more concerned with the whereabouts of her friend Waylon, who it turns out is not the corpse in the trunk. This leads to some interesting conversations with her fellow mechanic and friend Jag, who is of the opinion that it was Waylon who killed the person and stuffed him in the trunk. Jo believes this is absurd because why would Waylon have done that and then called for his car to be picked up and not been around? Jo decides on her next day off to visit the park in the daylight. Jag, being a hopeless clinger-on, decides that she shouldn't go alone and decides to accompany her. While investigating the woods near where the car was picked up, Jo's foot sinks into the ground, into some of the same burning substance that she found on the car. While stuck in the sinkhole, she notices a few things. First, a number of ravens gathering around them in the trees. Second, a purple light she can't identify. Third, once her foot is finally removed from the hole, a hand comes up that only she sees, and immediately recedes back into the hole. Not being sure if she's just seeing things, she decides to call it a day, and spends the next day a local fort, which a lot of the local skaters and ne'er-do-wells have decided to use as their own personal skate park and tagging grounds. Jo is the only one there at the time, but notices two out-of-towners show up and approach the fort with obvious intentions of sightseeing. She also sees what looks like Waylon running towards the two people. Jo immediately dives into the inner workings of the fort in order to try to catch Waylon. She quickly finds herself in a part of the catacombs under the fort that she does not recognize, and is immediately being chased by something she can't see. Sprinting down the tunnel, she comes across a crack that she can crawl through, but whatever is chasing her she hopes will not. On the other side, she appears to simply sink into the water and lose consciousness. Here's where things start to get weird. Jo wakes up in a place called Postmortem, which is kind of like the afterlife's waiting room. After meeting with the enigmatic soul, who seems to be more of a companion and caretaker to the souls under her charge, she settles in for just long enough to find out this is only a pit stop. As soon, Sharon and Val appear. Sharon being a Grim Reaper dressed entirely in white, whose job it is to ferry people to judgment, and Val being a Val Raven, a supernatural being who guides the Grim Reaper to the dead. And here's where I'm going to stop with the recap. This will bring you to about the 40% mark of the book, but there's also a lot of small details that I didn't touch on. It's also after this point that you start to discover the oddities of the city and an explanation as to why it may be so screwed up. One of the things I like about the book is that it's written more like Joe's stream of consciousness rather than in traditional first person. It's almost narration, but not quite. We get a lot of Joe's colloquialisms, as she refers to the citizens of Baltimore as Baltimoreans, the city itself as Bodymore instead of Baltimore, as well as the name badges for cops and mics for reporters. Joe as a character is fairly jaded, and it's no wonder. Her life has not been good up to this point. She's a high school dropout, she has a very bad relationship with her father, and a confused relationship with her friends Waylon and Jag, both of which seem to want to date Joe, and neither of which Joe is sure should let them. There is the slight problem that Joe is not always the most reliable of narrators. But despite her inconsistencies, the story does remain consistent throughout. There is a definite structure and mystery to the way that death works in this series that wasn't too difficult to parse out, but is still enough of an enigma to keep you interested. Without trying to spoil anything, I do believe that by the end, Joe makes a very bad choice, but is amazingly consistent with her character. Joe has spent most of her life making bad choices, and doesn't seem to believe that making one more will do her any harm. If it sounds like I'm not touching on the other characters very much, well, there's a good reason for that. Joe's friend Jag is obviously quite smitten with Joe, as is her friend Waylon. And while they're a bit fleshed out, Joe just always feels like the most prominent character wherever she is. That being said, Sharon and Val feel more like forces of nature than actual characters. They are rigid, structured, and the epitome of lawful, which is what you should expect from a Grim Reaper in anything that assists him. Even when Joe is directly flippant with them, they seem to regard her as little more than talking furniture. And while they will answer her questions, are very difficult to get more specifics out of. They are both also completely without mercy. That being said, the book does end with an interesting premise for a sequel, or even a series. It reminds me a lot of those shows from the early and late 90s that dealt with devils and demons like an everyday job, which are shows that I really did enjoy as a kid. It's pitched as horror, but not being a regular consumer of the genre, I didn't find it quite as scary as I thought horror should be. It is an interesting read, and I frequently found myself losing track of time while reading it. Had I started it a little bit earlier, it probably would have entered my read the entire book in one sitting club, which is unusual for a book of its length. But with that being said, I will leave you all to your readings. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my review. If you enjoyed it, you can find others on my YouTube, BitChute, and Odyssey channels. If you are an independent author and would like a chance at having a review, I have master lists on Minds, Gab, and Twitter pinned at the top of my feed. Please leave your book name, the way you would like readers to contact you, and a place where you can be reached and your work can be found. Thank you.